Hello, welcome to Sociology of Crime, Lecture 2, Week 1. To remind you where we were, in the last lecture we looked at what is criminology and what is crime, particularly 4 definitions, some of the ways that those definitions might complicate or contradict each other. This lecture we're looking at paradigms for understanding crime. We'll start with some non-sociological or even pre-modern conceptions of crime, move our way through sociological perspectives. For the final lecture, beginning of the next lecture, we'll look at the differences between these sociological paradigms. So we think of perspectives in some ways. We sociologically can use the term ideology. The British spelling is A-E, the American spelling is just E, so you might see this term written either the way I have it here or just etiology. They mean the same thing. The term etiology means, etiology is the study of the root origins or causes, right? So it's a term used in medical literature, for example, a lot if we want to know the root origins of a particular disease. In this context, we're using it to describe how different perspectives, how different worldviews fundamentally understand the root origins or causes of crime, right? So the oldest, at least in the Western tradition, etiology is thinking of crime as sin from a religious perspective. The first, probably truly modern perspective in the West is classical criminology. We have the medical model. This is Lombroso. I'm sure you all learned a little bit about this last year. The development of the Italian school. The rise of contemporary rational choice theories, contemporary within the latter part of the 20th century, a kind of return of some of the classical assumptions of crime control, people as rational actors, rational choice theory, situational crime prevention, etc. Finally, we can think of sociology and the social science as a distinct ideology. Okay? So we'll look at these each in turn a little bit here. This concept of crime as sin, absolutely the oldest perspective, at least in the Western tradition, but still very much present in the modern world, right? I regularly read the news from the United States, for example. Just read an article last week with somebody who's going to trial for murdering somebody while trying to exorcise them, because they were demonically possessed, right? So it's incorrect to say this is only a pre-modern view of crime. Many people in the Western world still see the roots of crime in some sense as fundamentally rooted in a Judeo-Christian cosmology or framework. These have their origins in histories that eventually overtook pagan Europe after the fall of Rome, where crime is equated with sin or transgression. In the West specifically is equated with evil, temptation, the devil. The sociologist Stephen Foale calls this the demonic perspective on crime and deviance. In this demonic perspective, he says the body and soul are seen as fundamentally distinct or even at odds with one another. The larger function of this perspective, he argues, in line with many scholars that have looked at history of deviance, the history of the body in the Western tradition. The primary function of this, from the perspective of thinking of crime as the result of temptation or evil, is to save the soul. So as Foale notes, in this perspective, there's nothing particularly sacred about the body. For us, as moderns, right, we think of historically bodily integrity as a primary, a fundamental right. The state cannot seize our, right, cannot put us under arrest, etc., etc. Right? 1,000 years ago in the West, this was not the case, right? In fact, it was seen in many ways as the obligation of the church or the obligation of rulers to do what was required with the body, whether that was torture, whether that was, to solicit a confession, whether it was, imprisonment, in order to facilitate a transformation whereby a person's soul could still be potentially saved, right? So there's nothing particularly sacred about the body in a world which gave primacy to supernatural imagery. There was little profit in preserving the body at the expense of the soul. Okay, so the West has a lot of extremely sordid histories around the development of things like torture, development of things like confession, designed to solicit salvation in the form of confession, but very often used as a means of social control and power. Between 500,000 and 1 million women were burned at the stake in Europe over a period of about 200 years, from the 14th to the late 16th century. We have similar systemic forms of violence against non-believers, etc., etc. So all of these, in some sense, fall under this cosmological perspective, looking at the universe as a great battle between good and evil, and crime as a result of either the temptation, the devil, or demonic possession. Okay? So this is a dominant explanation in the West up until the beginning of the Renaissance and corresponding Enlightenment. It's not really until the 14 or 1500s in the West that we see the beginning of what we might think of as more rational explanations for criminal or deviant behavior. The person who sets forth the strongest argument, which is still a quite influential one today, that takes a lot of this is this guy here, Cesar Beccaria. Beccaria doesn't invent these ideas. He follows the arguments of people like Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, other social contract theorists, who have been arguing for some time that the world isn't simply dominated by superstition or supernatural beings, that people are imbued with reason, the ability to make decisions about what is right and wrong, not simply a result of being forced by temptation or supernatural beings, etc. Okay? So he follows the work of social contract theorists in arguing for desirability of a social contract between people and their governors. Okay? This is common sense for us today, right? There's nothing controversial, but arguing, that the people that rule should be elected by a larger population, and that there should be some sense of a contract between the people that are being ruled and the people that are ruling that meet the best interests of both. You have to remember this is coming off of over 1,000 years of absolutist monarchy, right? Where the king or the queen or the nobility is the state, right? So this was a direct threat, a direct challenge to feudalism, to 1,000 years or more in some cases of direct authoritarian rule, the notion of divine right of kingships, right? All of this is being challenged at this point. So people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Hobbes or other people made the argument that the social contract is a preferable form of governance for the simple reason that it is able to better meet the needs of more people than authoritarian rule of things like kings or monarchies, right? The fundamental dictum of social contract theory is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay? And the way that we achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number, argued people like Hobbes, was through representative forms of government. Beccaria's work followed this social contract theory, but it was primarily concerned with what happens when people break this contract. So he makes the argument that if we are not going to live in an absolutist state, if we're not simply going to have monarchies, but we're going to have what we might call today a rule of law, by which we elect our representatives and they govern us justly, then the amount of punishment that we are able to use, or that states are able to use, must similarly be the least amount possible to ensure this greatest good, right? So he makes the argument that punishment is an appropriate response to people's choice to violate the social contract, but for it to be just, it should be only of such a gradation of intensity to suffice to deter men from committing crimes. What we have here then is a fundamentally different etiology for explaining criminal behavior. Gone are the ghosts and the demons and the things that haunt us in the night that make us do things that we shouldn't do. In is, a mind, a quality of mind that makes calculated, rational decisions on whether it makes sense to commit a particular offense, what are the risks, what are the rewards. So we see the beginning of the modern origins of what we refer to as deterrence theory, right? This is why classical criminology, even though in many ways has been eclipsed by other more contemporary theoretical explanations, why it has such central staying power is its initial contribution to the assumption of deterrence theory, which, as we'll talk about throughout the term, is still very much with us today. So, Beccaria makes the argument that the most effective response to violations of the social contract is punishment, thus setting forth the beginning of modern deterrence theory. And the assumption of deterrence theory is that most people act as rational actors, right? The philosophy of Jeremy Bentham is particularly important, and we'll look at this in week 3. Bentham, undoubtedly the most prominent English philosopher of his day, made the argument that people are really drawn or moved or motivated in their social actions by two polarities, by pleasure and pain. We're not talking about hedonistic pleasure, right? Pleasure is a warm roof. Pleasure is, your kids going to a safe school. Pleasure is, food in your belly, right? So hedonism he uses the term hedonism, but it's not used in the vernacular in the way it is today, right? We're not talking about spring break or whatever. And it says, most people seek to maximize, measure, and minimize pain, and that crime as such can best be reduced through the certainty of being caught for criminal acts. The more certain people think they are of being caught, the less likely they are to commit these acts. Swiftness of punishment. The faster the application of punishment, he argues, the less likely they are to commit further criminal acts. And severity of punishment, right? The punishment must be severe enough to deter the person, the would-be offender, right? So here is where we really move into Bentham's work, his notion of a hedonistic calculus. If a robbery, he says, brings 6 units of pleasure, well, the punishment should be a corresponding 7 units of pain, right? He makes the argument that we can actually figure out appropriate relationships mathematically. Right? So with the rise of the Enlightenment, we see, this massive transformation within 100 years from thinking of people as largely, being pushed or pulled by supernatural forces to thinking of them as largely rational actors. Within the next 100 years, this changes radically again, right? We move into pathological explanations of crime. Not quite sure what's up with that picture, but I'll go in and make sure I swap it back out in the actual lecture notes. Okay, in the late 19th century sees a shift from classical explanations to biological and later psychological explanations of deviance. So the rational school, founded by Beccaria, heavily promoted by people like Bentham, begins to falter at the beginning, middle of the 1800s. By the middle and the end of the 1800s, explanations of crime are increasingly being set forth by what's called the Italian school, right? Cesare Lombroso publishes The Criminal Man in 1876, where he had studied the cadavers of executed criminals as well as spent time researching prisoners. He determines that serious criminal activity is probably an inherited trait, right? So this is an extremely important distinction in the history of the evolution of criminological theory, right? Where Beccaria makes the argument, people choose crime. It's a rational decision, okay, with some amount of thought or decision-making at some level cognitively. Lombroso makes a very different argument, right? No, he argues that crime is a dependent variable. It's dependent upon pathological, either psychological or, in his case, physiological deficiencies in some sense that compel people to act in certain ways. So his work is often called atavistic theory, for his concept of the atavist, right? An atavist can be defined as a throwback to an earlier evolutionary stage of development. And this refers to the notion that criminals can be identified by physical traits that in part explain their life in crime. So for this reason, we classify this sociologically as a form of biological determinism, an approach that eventually fell out of favor, although has returned in some sense in the study of genetics, and things like the search for an aggressive gene, et cetera, et cetera. We'll come back to this research in week 4. Finally, sociological explanations. 3 major sociological paradigms. Okay, we'll talk more about this in the last lecture for this week, but to briefly mention them here, functionalism. If you recall, I had linked this already to the sociologist Emile Durkheim, where his argument that crime, like other things, serves important social functions that keep a society stable, allow it to innovate, etc. The other 2 sociological paradigms here, social conflict and symbolic interactionism. Okay, the first 2 are considered micro, right? Macro. By macro, we mean they seek to explain larger social trends, okay? What happens at the level of social class, or what happens within large groups. Think of flying in a plane and looking down at big cities and the way that they're connected by, highways, and right. This is often I think of the level of analysis that happens for functional and social conflict approaches tends to be on this level. The last one is considered a micro paradigm. Symbolic interaction is much more concerned with the world of symbols, the way in which symbols are made, navigated, mediated, exchanged between people, that world of meaning. So it's often considered more of a micro paradigm. All right, so that concludes week 2. That concludes lecture 2 for week 1, and we'll move on in the 3rd and final lecture to looking at the 3 sociological paradigms in more detail.